I am sorry to bug you, but do you think you could survive the insect apocalypse? Except I'm not talking about some cheesy black and white movie from the 50s and 60s where giant radioactive bugs go on a rampage, which there seems to be an endless number of, where you gotta rely on your wit and very own adult squirt gun filled with insecticides. What the is this? Why does this exist? Are we indoctrinating the average person into a bug killer to make the mobile infantry proud? What I mean is, could you survive if all the insects disappeared? If it was like the exact opposite of a big bug movie? Most terrestrial animals are insects. Yes, animals. I will not tolerate the uninformed speciesist assertion that insects are not animals that my mosquito video seems to get. Insects tick off all the criteria to empirically be considered a form of animal life. Okay, with that mini rant done, insects, together with the rest of their arthropod cousins, do all sorts of important things in ecosystems. Things that make life possible for all the megafauna freeloading on their hard work. Take, for example, the rainforests of Borneo, which are absolutely packed with insects and other arthropods. They are all doing something, many doing essential services for the ecosystem. Pollination is an important service many insects do, often for a nectar reward. But for the parasitic Rafflesia flower, they just need a scent vaguely like rotting meat to draw in carrion flies as unwitting pollinators. This would be one of those freeloaders on the system. Like other tropical ecosystems such as the Amazon, many colorful species of butterfly are important pollinators for different plants. In this part of the world, there are birdwings, large, powerful butterflies that can travel far through the canopy to pollinate flowers. However, butterflies here also feed on other things, like fruit and even carrion, helping with the breakdown of organic matter. It is also important to mention that butterflies and moths are hungry caterpillars before they take to the wing, munching on tropical leaves and altering the outcomes of competition between plants. Other insects, like the large bird grasshoppers, also munch on plants, and are so numerous that in many ecosystems, insects consume as much biomass as the megafauna. So they are actually quite significant players on a stage that some might think big animals are especially good at. However, too many caterpillars or grasshoppers munching on leaves could be deleterious for the ecosystem as a whole. But while some vertebrates do take up the cause and hunt insects, they are far outnumbered by predatory arthropods, which, if you watched my previous video in this series, spiders are especially important in this regard, as are creatures like this giant long-legged centipede, which I do not want to get any closer to. However, insects like this assassin bug are also on the hunt, as are wasps looking to fill nest chambers with paralyzed, ready-to-go feasts for their larvae. Then there are dragonflies and damselflies which fly through the air capturing smaller insects like mosquitoes on the wing, all while looking pretty amazing. Odonates are just such beautiful insects. However, few other arthropods can compare to ants in terms of hunting down other arthropods. Ants feed on a variety of things, but need a lot of protein to fuel the growth of their colony, and so catch and dismember whatever poor bug they can get their mandibles on. They are often the apex predators of what is known as the brown food web, which is a name specifically for food webs based on detritus and dead organic matter instead of live plants, a series of connections we often overlook as it is hidden in the leaf litter, but just as complex as any green food web. Many arthropods in the leaf litter are part of the brown food web, often munching on dead plant material directly or eating fungi that do, like these lichen-feeding termites or the high diversity of Bornean millipedes, which are not insects, but I really wanted to show and mention some of these amazing animals because they are just great, including ones with pink spines and the many pill millipedes, which are some of the cutest arthropods, like giant colorful woodlice, and roll into a tight ball if threatened. Got to love these cyanide-filled many-legged detritivores. That is but a tiny taste of the arthropod and more specifically insect biodiversity and ecological functionality within the Bornean rainforest, illustrating some of the global roles they play. What would happen, though, if they were to disappear? If a insect apocalypse occurred, how would you survive it? Or even could you? So why exactly are we talking about this so-called insect apocalypse, and should you be worried? Well, insects do so many functions in ecosystems, as I hopefully highlighted in the forests of Borneo, that the loss of insects could be catastrophic. There would be next to nothing to eat, as between insects pollinating plants and being eaten themselves, they are essentially critical to the functioning of most terrestrial ecosystems. While declines have been noticed anecdotally, such as with the windshield phenomenon, that people who are not Zoomers and young millennials remember a time when lots of large insects would splat against the car's windshield, something that doesn't really happen anymore. Finally, hard data has begun to come in as studies on insects are published. The first big one being in 2017. Findings since 1990, the biomass of flying insects across several protected areas in Germany had declined by over 75%. This study got media attention and began the early use of the term insect apocalypse or insect Armageddon, a shocking title to get views, which is my hope with this video, but also I hope to educate. Like and subscribe! Since the 2017 study, many other studies and reviews of all these studies have occurred, though the reviews tend to be criticized for strong wording and imperfect data selection, as is the challenge with any review or meta-analysis. It does seem insects are declining at an alarming rate, but the actual amount of biomass and biodiversity being lost has to be estimated through models, and that is complicated by insects declining locally in some areas, but not in others, one group of insects doing better than others. It is just very difficult to estimate. But to keep things simple, what would happen if much of insect biomass and biodiversity were to disappear? Well, for starters, around 80% of plants are pollinated by insects and 60% of birds eat insects, so they would be gone. And while the quote, "If the bee disappears from the surface of the earth, man would have no more than 4 years to live," was never said by Albert Einstein, and the 4-year estimate has no backing in science, there is some truth to it. The late entomologist E.O. Wilson did a thought experiment on what if insects and other terrestrial arthropods were to disappear. His prediction was even shorter, that after a few months, most terrestrial vertebrate life, amphibians, reptiles, birds, many freshwater fish, and mammals, including humans, would decline rapidly to extinction due to the lack of food. Animals that eat insects serve as food for larger animals. No pollination means no fruit, leaving only those that could survive on nothing but vegetables. But they would ultimately die out with the extinction of most flowering plants over the next 100 years, as no new generation of plants would replace the older plants. With that, our existing ecosystems would unravel. Forests, dominated by great fruiting trees such as the Amazon, would disappear. But they wouldn't just disappear. They would die and be left to rot. No insects to break them down, and so around the world, nutrient cycling would cease to work, and create great dead zones where other complex plant life would be unable to grow, and fungi would inherit the earth. So, of only the 12 or so % of plants that are pollinated by the wind and not insects, many would vanish. But perhaps, in parts of the planet already dominated by wind-pollinated plants, they could perhaps survive, and it is there perhaps you too could survive the insect apocalypse. Ferns don't need insects to reproduce, so fiddleheads would be on the table. Similarly, pines are wind-pollinated, so there would be pine nuts. Of flowering plants, pecans, pistachios, and oaks, along with many grasses, including important crops like corn, barley, rye, rice, wheat, and oats. With this, some animal life could persist, maybe some squirrels, some grazers like cows, some seed-eating birds if they could get enough protein, and, as I said, many fungi, though many do partner with or parasitize arthropods, so they would die off too, but plenty of mushrooms in places that remain wet despite the lack of plant transpiration. I think your best bet would be to get to the temperate zones where pines dominate, or some woodlands dominated by oaks, or deserts where pistachios grow. Or we have done a good job of turning many grasslands into monocultures of wind-pollinated crops. So as long as you could clear the dead vegetation and find a way to compost it yourself without arthropods, maybe you could grow some crops. Maybe even some fruiting trees. Today, some farmers in China have started pollinating all their pears and apples by hand, when many of the bees in Sichuan province disappeared and couldn't be relied on. You could also go out to sea, I guess, and eat fish. So I guess by living out in a pine forest in the Pacific Northwest, a cornfield in the American Midwest, or the deserts of Central Asia, You might be able to scratch out a living in this smelly post-apocalyptic landscape with your small band of pecan farming survivors. But maybe eventually the buildup of organic material would destroy the remaining complex forms of plant life, or all the rotting organic matter from everything dying would up the atmosphere, and it would become unbreathable. Though that would probably happen hundreds to thousands of years later, so you personally wouldn't need to worry about that. And humans are really good at not thinking about how they make life harder for their descendants. Living in a smelly, rotting world that is probably doomed, pollinating apple trees and scrounging for pine nuts, though sounds really terrible. Fortunately, we are unlikely to see every species of terrestrial arthropod go extinct. However, we are seeing some worrying declines that could make life harder and drive biodiversity declines across ecosystems. Pollinators especially have been on the decline. This is likely a combination of habitat loss, replacing more biologically diverse communities with monocultures, and of course poisoning the field to kill insects. For over half a century, we have been treating all sorts of nasty synthetically derived chemicals as the end-all be-all. Not just one insect control tool among many more traditional methods. And now the environment is full of that. One particular kind of synthetic chemical of concern are neonicotinoids. First introduced in 1991, they were a game changer, able to be used without spraying either treating seeds or the soil, allowing the plants to take them up and incorporate it into their tissues. Any insect that feeds on them dies, whether eating a leaf, sucking from the stem, or visiting flowers. Just months after being introduced to European agriculture, beekeepers noticed their hives rapidly collapse after feeding on treated sunflower fields. However, these compounds don't always kill outright, especially when it comes to pollinators, instead stressing the immune system, allowing pathogens to infect and kill the unfortunate animal. Evidence suggests animals like frogs, fish, birds, and bats might all be at risk of catching diseases because of exposure to neonicotinoids. Similarly, herbicides can be devastating as they can eliminate important plants, which seems to be a reason why the remarkable migratory monarch butterfly population appears to be collapsing. They need milkweed, but the Midwest of the US is filled with genetically modified crops that are tolerant of herbicides, which farmers dump all over the place, driving a decline of plants like milkweed. So that is something we'll have to consider, that we will live in a world without migratory monarch butterflies, because it was easier to create poison-tolerant mutant plants. The ultimate challenge here, though, is convincing people to protect insects is very difficult, which we're going to break down like a millipede feeding on leaf litter into several key challenges to insect conservation. First, the importance of insects is not well known to the public, which hopefully this video, with ideally a catchy title and a description of a world without insects, can help a little with. Then comes politics, where policymakers just sort of assume by protecting big animals, you protect insects, which if you are curious about some of the issues with assuming this, I have a whole video on umbrella species. Next, we have the fact that you cannot get an entomology project funded in science, unless it's finding ways to more effectively kill them, which feeds into the remaining reasons, as they are all due to the fact we are not doing basic insect studies. Most have not been described by science. We don't know exactly where they are found, how common they are, and finally their ecology is poorly understood. Can we tell for sure a species is really vulnerable to habitat loss or neonicotinoids? We don't know, and nobody's going to pay for it. But once the issues have been identified, that means we have a roadmap to solve them. At least one would think. This is where you come in. You should now have a vague idea about how important insects are to human life, so hopefully you will join in and help protect these tiny but essential creatures, which you can actually help with. Don't use pesticides and herbicides on your garden. Plant native flowering plants. Replace lawns dominated by one species with a more biodiverse collection of plants. Maybe build something like a bee hotel, so together we can ensure healthy insect populations, which will make us all healthier. Because we need bugs.